So by clicking on this video, you're probably wondering, how is a dice, an inanimate object, going to be helping me invent or even just design something new? And to answer that, it's not. As a matter of fact, it's going to be completely randomizing things. Let me explain what I have to do. I'm going to be rolling this dice, which is then going to determine the number of times that I have to spin a wheel, which has a list of all of the mechanisms that I've ever talked about on my channel. Now, whatever mechanisms I randomly end up with is the mechanisms that I have to use for an invention. Without further ado, let's roll this dice. One roll, and one roll only. Let's hope for a good number. Okay, 4. Yeah, so there's 10 mechanisms on this wheel, and I get 4. Expanding pulley. I'll put a video on the screen just so you guys know what the mechanisms actually are. Crank slider. Okay. 4 is actually a pretty good number, thinking about it right now. 6 would have made things too complicated. A bevel gear. Alright, the last one. An iris mechanism. Okay. So I'm not going to bore you with my initial reaction because I was just speaking a bunch of gibberish. However, could you blame me? I was just given all these random mechanisms and I had no idea how to combine them. Like literally, I was given a crank slider mechanism, which is used for car engines, and then I was given an iris mechanism, which is used for camera lenses. On top of that, I was also given a bevel gear, which is used for car differentials and other types of machinery. And lastly, I was given this random mechanism that was found in a 150-year-old book. Even right now, it's been like 1 hour since that happened, and I still can't think of anything. But I'm not about to give up that easily. If you don't know this, I'm an engineering student. And engineers are people who can solve problems no matter how many constraints that they're given. And in this project, I was only given 4 constraints that I have to use 1, 2, 3, and 4 mechanisms. So if I couldn't find a solution to this, how could I ever call myself an engineer in the future? So I packed my bags, and I spent the next few days just thinking, and thinking, and thinking, until it finally hit me. So it's been a few days already of just thinking and tweaking around with the mechanisms, but let me just tell you what I discovered. These mechanisms are actually pretty easy to manipulate, and they're not limited to just one orientation only. So for example right here, the expanding pulley can be shortened like what you see on the screen. It can also be hexagonal rather than circular, and you can even change the amount of limbs that it has. Moving on, we have the bevel gear, which can be attached to components, and it also doesn't have to have a full radius of teeth. You can also experiment with endless amounts of gear ratios with the bevel gears, which is why the bevel gear is probably the most common mechanism out of all of these. Now for the crank slider, it can be adjusted by means of the crank, the coupler, or even the slider to change the linear distances that it travels. Now for the iris mechanism, it's not as versatile as the other mechanisms, but it does have several types of designs. But the biggest advantage of all of these mechanisms was that they all included rotary motion, so I knew for a fact that there would be a solution to combine them all into one sort of design. So after much thought and endless designing, this is what I came up with. So I couldn't find a practical purpose for the expanding pulley mechanism, so I just decided to give it the purpose of pure aesthetics. And then we have the iris mechanism here, which opens perfectly in sync with a rising crank slider mechanism. And then lastly, to finish it off, we have the bevel gears, which pretty much just connects all the mechanisms together. So I have just finished 3D printing every single component needed for this design. And let me tell you, it took a long time. 3D printing is very slow. It is very slow. It took at least 12 hours to print every single piece. That's how slow it is. So I'm just gonna finish this project off by assembling all the pieces together just as it was on the 3D model, and I'll be done. Yeah, I mean, I've had instances in the past where my 3D prints didn't work as well as expected, but I'm feeling confident about this one. So this model doesn't even frickin' work. Well, that's not entirely true, because things were going well when I started to assemble the expanding pulley mechanism. I got all the components, and as expected, it was moving like it was in the model. Then again, I went onto the iris mechanism, and as expected, it was moving like it was supposed to. Then things started to look funny when I went onto the crank slider mechanism, because for some reason, the crank slider wasn't actually moving up like it did in the computer. So seeing this problem, I decided to investigate and see what could have caused such an issue. The slider was moving up in the computer model, but for the 3D print, it wasn't. It was like I was forgetting some sort of mysterious, strong, and supernatural force that was pulling the crank slider mechanism towards the center of the Earth. Gravity. I forgot to consider the effects of gravity. Yeah, computer-aided design models don't actually include the effects of gravity when you're making 3D models. It's only when you run a simulation that it can actually include those effects. Now, am I about to give up? Nah. I'm already like 6 minutes into this video. I can't back out now. Plus, my editor's been editing for hours now. I'm pretty sure he just wants us to get this video over with. So yeah, needless to say, I think I'm just gonna have to find a solution to counteract the effects of the light force of gravity that's acting upon this crank slider. So let's see what I come up with. So I've just pulled up a lecture from a few months ago in a class that I've had, and honestly I probably should have done this way long ago, but what I'm seeing right here is that crank sliders and pretty much just any 4-bar linkage mechanism has something that's called a transmission angle. And the transmission angle for crank sliders is the angle between the slider and the coupler. Now if this angle is too small, then the crank slider isn't going to work as well as you saw with my design. So I'm gonna have to make this angle probably not a lot more larger, but definitely larger than the angle that I have right now. And the way that I'm gonna increase this transmission angle is probably just by shortening that crank on the crank slider mechanism, and hopefully after that this crank slider mechanism will work as it should. And shortening that crank is exactly what I did. Luckily, that's all I had to do, because redesigning this entire system would have to be an absolute nightmare if I had to do it. And plus, I did not want to stay home all day and 3D print everything all over again. So with that last 3D printed component, I finally started to put together this entire assembly. And honestly, it wasn't looking easy at all. I was using literal super glue to put some components together, but it still wouldn't stick. And on top of that, these bevel gears were hard to line up. I couldn't see through the pieces to see where the bevel gears were lining up. It wasn't like my computer design where I could make any component transparent. I was literally taking shots in the dark. And quite frankly, this is all my fault. Because as an engineer, you gotta take into consideration the assembly process, the manufacturing process, how things are gonna work in the real world, not just in the computer. But despite my errors, I still found some ways to make this thing work. For example, instead of using the weight of my microphone to glue pieces together, I used the weight of my whole body to glue them together. And honestly, it worked. Brute force worked. So I continued to do that. As for the alignment of the bevel gears, I just had to feel them out, and honestly, it worked. Things were starting to come together. I actually managed to combine the most random set of mechanisms into a single invention. And it's at this point that I realized that I've actually never told you guys what I was inventing throughout this entire video. So I present to you guys the never seen before over-engineered ring display. And if I could tell you anything, that's pretty much what engineering is all about. It's about taking in constraints, getting creative, failing some more, then revising, adapting, and after a long time, succeeding and finding fulfillment in your work. If you enjoyed what I did throughout this video, maybe you too should consider studying engineering, because there are many unsolved problems in this world that require solutions, and maybe you can contribute to finding solutions to them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.